The Final Fantasy VII Remake project has provoked intense speculation since its initial release about the future of legacy Final Fantasy titles. The rumours of a Final Fantasy IX remake have further provoked discussion about revisiting the PlayStation 1 trifecta, and for many the potential for, and indeed the radio silence around, a future for Final Fantasy VIII. However, looking to Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth specifically, there's a case to suggest that they harm the chances of a Final Fantasy VIII remake, in the immediate future at least, not because of any given audience's reception or sales or anything like that, but more so because the trajectory of Final Fantasy VII's renewed story is in a surprisingly close proximity to Final Fantasy VIII. Indeed, if I were to guess at a Final Fantasy game based on a plot that features an antagonist who's messing around with time, a thematic symbolism of white and black feathers being used to signify a yin and yang duality of hero and villain, and even the subtle appearance of Gilgamesh and the introduction of a card game, I'd be forgiven for jumping to conclusions that you're talking about Final Fantasy VIII. However, the arc of Final Fantasy VII Remake is, with each instalment, leaning ever closer into the plot elements and the ancillary devices that made Final Fantasy VIII so unique. This is not to suggest that Final Fantasy VII is consciously copying or attempting to retell Final Fantasy VIII, but rather that certain elements are being folded in and used to augment the retelling of Final Fantasy VII in this sequelized instalment. So how is Final Fantasy VII Remake adopting traits of Final Fantasy VIII? How and why is this happening? And what does it mean for the fortunes of Final Fantasy VIII in the future? Jumping right in with the first point of a time-bending antagonist, this is central to the story of Final Fantasy VIII, with Ultimecia, a tragic if vindictive antagonist who creates a self-fulfilling prophecy as she travels from future to present in order to successfully achieve time compression. Her motives stem in part from mankind's fear and contempt of her as a sorceress in her own time, and her own fear of the fabled seed mercenaries who are destined to destroy her. Owing to the laws of succession, where a sorceress must pass down her powers in Final Fantasy VIII, the game ends where it begins, where Ultimecia passes her powers onto Adia as matron, and a time-compressed Squall informs Adia of the need to create the seed academies of the future. So that is very much, broadly speaking, the use of time in Final Fantasy VIII. In 1997's Final Fantasy VII, there is no such time-bending angle to the plotline. There is a comparatively internalised battle between our main protagonist Cloud Strife, his amnesic past, and our main antagonist Sephiroth. But there is very little interaction or acknowledgement between these two, with the latter, Sephiroth, barely acknowledging Cloud or seeing him as a threat until well into the story. Final Fantasy VII Remake, however, adopts a very curious retelling of this same but different story, and one of the most significant differences in Final Fantasy VII Remake is Sephiroth being aware of Cloud, acknowledging that this guy is a threat. And indeed, he's not just aware of Cloud, but he is actively hounding him from pretty much the beginning of the first Remake game. So there's a few reasons for this, which root back to a general acknowledgement that Final Fantasy VII Remake is a continuity and a sequel to the original game, and Sephiroth is thus traversing through space-time. Now, the reason he's hounding Cloud and friends, unlike the original game, is that this time around he is aware that they are the heroes that are going to undermine his plans in the original or canonical timeline. Furthermore, and most pressingly, this entire storyline takes place, is the fact that Square Enix decided to make the remake a continuity game, a sequel game, rather than simply a retelling of the original story. Now, it would be very hard for them to convincingly sell a Final Fantasy VII sequel without Sephiroth included. He and Cloud are the dual yin and yang. They are the core, the nucleus of Final Fantasy VII's adventure as hero and villain. And as we can see from the sequel movie, Advent Children, with the remnants, Kadaj, there's this aspect of Sephiroth that needed to be retained and ultimately revealed at the end of that movie to retain the legacy and perhaps even the integrity of what Final Fantasy VII is. And indeed, we can observe several instances from games, movies and TV shows where a really strong villain gets killed off and then subsequent material, subsequent installments just seem a bit rubbish by comparison. So can fully appreciate Square's intent to keep Sephiroth around. The real predicament of the Final Fantasy VII Remake then was finding a way to plausibly have Sephiroth survive and return to the central story after his emphatic demise at the end of the original game. There's several ways that this is conventionally done across media. One such example is having external forces attempting to resurrect and revive the villain, which was sort of done in Advent Children. And another one which is what Remake decided to use, is this sort of alternative timeline angle where a variant of Sephiroth, or a master Sephiroth, has returned from the live stream, is able to traverse through space-time, and has this much more comprehensive, omniscient view of everything, including his own demise, which again is why he's hounding Cloud. Of course, some more than others are on board with this retelling of the story, along with the Whispers attempting to steer events in their own way in this new telling of Final Fantasy VII. But regardless of one's opinion of that and setting all of that aside, I think a key thing this does is ultimately step on the toes of Final Fantasy VIII's central thrust of story, because of course Ultimecia's time meddling is very comparable, though ostensibly different in function, to what Sephiroth is doing in the remake games. Next we have the iconography of the feathers. This is something that has to some degree or another ticked along in both games. In Final Fantasy VIII's opening moments we see Rinoa heartily holding the feather that is then whisked away in the breeze, and through the opening FMV we see this flurry and conflation of white and black feathers that, depending on who you ask, symbolise the yin and yang between Rinoa and Squall. I always felt that they were more this sort of duality and hint at the light and dark between Rinoa and Ultimecia. I've always leaned towards this because of course Rinoa has the white angel wings on her attire and in her limit break, and they juxtapose with Ultimecia, who has black angel wings. Turning to Final Fantasy VII, we have Cloud and Sephiroth. Now, admittedly, in the original Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth's boss theme at the end of the game is called One-Winged Angel. Since then, we've had the release of Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, and this is where they really started dialing up the symbolism of feathers and angel wings. Of course, we have the character of Angel, the clones and stuff like that going on with Hollander. And that was where, this iconography really took hold in Final Fantasy VII, which, again, as we see in the Remake and the Rebirth installments, they've really sort of retained this. But the thing that stuck out to me the most was the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth trailer, which almost verbatim copied the opening of Final Fantasy VIII in how this solitary feather is whisked and then pans across in this opening FMV. So it was quite close to home. It was quite close for comfort looking at the two ways that these feathers were utilised, and particularly how Remake seemed to be aping these elements of Final Fantasy VIII. Finally, we have Gilgamesh, but more significantly I think we have the card game Queen's Blood, which is a very overt successor to Final Fantasy VIII's comparatively more simple triple triad. And of course, each to their own with which they prefer of these games. Queen's Blood was much more involved and advanced in gameplay, though triple triad, I would argue, really had much more payoff and reward for what you could do with the cards and getting tangible items out of them. So these are some key things that are going on between Final Fantasy VIII and subsequently with the remake games. So what's going on here? Why has Final Fantasy VII adopted so many traits from Final Fantasy VIII and subsequently has made it so much more improbable that we will see any sort of Final Fantasy VIII material come about? For my part, I think it comes down to Yoshinori Kitase as a writer and a director and a creative quite a lot. And he has had considerable input and ownership of both titles. And to a lesser degree, or perhaps an equal degree, we have the duology of Tetsuya Nomura and Kazushige Najima. And each of these three, they were like the trifecta, the driving force behind Final Fantasy VIII's creation, who recombined to get the Final Fantasy VII Remake project off the ground. Now, I don't think they have necessarily purposefully taken aspects of Final Fantasy VIII, but rather I think it's common for writers and creatives and directors to retread the same themes and have these commonalities in their work in various guises over time. Looking at some of my favourite creators and kind of looking at the filmographies and bibliographies of a lot of writers and directors that I like, they do seem to do this. The Coen brothers, for example, their films constantly indulge this existential absurdity of being. Martin McDonagh explores the intersection and juxtaposition between violence and innocence, and also a certain Irishness that comes about in almost all of his media. And then we have Graham Greene, who was a writer that was absolutely obsessed with his Catholic identity and Catholic guilt, which undulated in almost all of his novels to some degree or another. And in keeping with this, I've likewise always felt that some combination of this Squaresoft trio in Nomura, Kitase and Najima, and certainly so when Kitase's in the driving seat, seem to be concerned with the passage of time. Final Fantasies VII, Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X each deeply explore the cause and effect between past and present. Even in the original Final Fantasy VII, the pivotal reveal in Cloud's story resides in past events, this fallacy of himself living out actions of Zack Fair. Tidus and Yuna in Final Fantasy X are both driven by, and in some ways kind of haunted by, the legacy of their parents. And Final Fantasy VIII, as we've touched on here, very overtly indulges past and present through the Squall and Laguna story, but more so through the plot device of Ultimecia kind of travelling back and forth through time. Looking at the oeuvre of this particular Final Fantasy trio then, it's perhaps no surprise that they have retrodden a story that is concerned with the machinations of time, even if inadvertently they seem to be aping the story beats that they've already explored in Final Fantasy VIII. Likewise, the use of the feather symbolism, the use of card games and Gilgamesh, which they've pulled like spare parts out of the legacy of Final Fantasy VIII and into the shiny new expanded Final Fantasy VII universe. It seems that they have just very singularly taken bits that they like from previous games. They've taken all the things that they've previously done really well and opted to just throw them in to this new product. So the more cynical of us, we might suppose that they have basically abandoned Final Fantasy VIII entirely. They've looked at the things that they consider to be good ideas in it and just pulled them out into the remake saga. But conversely, and perhaps more likely, these guys just really like to reuse themes and plot devices that they've long since devised. Gilgamesh is a great example of this, because I think Kitase debuted him back in Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy V, and he's appeared in basically almost every Kitase game since then. But regardless, the fact remains that there's a lot of aspects of Final Fantasy VIII that we can see bubbling up in the Final Fantasy VII Remake that ultimately don't bode well for the fortunes of any sort of continuity remake or revisiting of that title. And the reason being is that despite, or perhaps on top of, Square's already quite neglective attitude towards FF8, Final Fantasy VII Remake is yet to conclude at the time of recording, and it's very likely going to conclude and lean even harder into this time-bending finale. So, based on proximity alone, it's highly unlikely that a Final Fantasy VIII story would be considered in such proximity to a game that is now adopting its plot elements. Which is why I think the rumours abound that Final Fantasy IX is being remade first. And for my part, I wouldn't even be surprised if Final Fantasy VI was going to get a remake treatment before FF8, if Square are to continue going down this road of remaking legacy games. So it's a very strange state of affairs, and I've often discussed Kitase and his ownership of Final Fantasy VIII as quite an odd legacy to have. It's something that he must have obviously invested a lot of his own self and time into. It was his first autonomous game without the consistent oversight of Hironobu Sakaguchi, and thus it seems like something he's also taken personally and really quite abandoned when it was roundly denounced by a lot of fans, vocal minority or not. Yet it's also something that I think he personally must think has a lot of great ideas in it, and so perhaps he is trying to slip them in elsewhere. But ultimately, this comes at the expense of Final Fantasy VIII itself, and any hopes that us fans have for future projects that involve it.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon, or if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.